November 9th, 1932, Moscow, the Kremlin.
Early in the morning, in Joseph Stalin's private Kremlin apartment, his 31-year-old wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, was found dead. According to the memoirs of their daughter, Svetlana, her mother lay in a pool of blood next to her bed. Clutched in her hand was a small Walther pistol, a gift from her brother, Soviet military officer Pavel Alliluyev. Nadezhda had died from a single gunshot to the heart. According to one version, the body was discovered by their housekeeper, Karolina Till. According to another, it was Stalin himself who had left the previous evening for his country residence, his dacha, but mysteriously returned to the Kremlin early that morning. The official cause of Nadezhda Alliluyeva's death was announced as a sudden attack of appendicitis. However, almost immediately, rumors began to circulate throughout Moscow. Either Nadezhda had committed suicide or Stalin himself had shot her. On November 12, 1932, a viewing was held. Nadezhda's body lay in state in an open coffin on the top floor of Moscow's GUM department store, located directly opposite the Kremlin. The ceremony was attended by Stalin, their son Vasily, and various party and government officials. Ordinary citizens were barred entirely from attending. This is what Nadezhda's niece, Kira Alliluyeva, recalled.
Standing beside his wife's coffin, Stalin, with a mixture of despair and rage, declared, "She left as an enemy." With those words, he pushed the coffin so hard that it nearly fell from its pedestal. Then he turned to Pavel Yanukidze, a high-ranking Soviet official and Nadezhda's godfather, and said, "You baptized her, you bury her." Stalin did not attend the funeral at the cemetery. The only woman he truly loved was buried without him.
Stalin's phrase, "she left as an enemy," was no accident. What exactly did he mean, and why did he see an enemy in his own wife? Biographer Olga Trifonova, who spent nearly 20 years researching Alliluyeva's life, asserts that Nadezhda was covertly tasked with assassinating her husband. But what really happened on that fateful night? And what was it like to be the wife of the 20th century's most terrifying dictator? Nadezhda Alliluyeva, affectionately known to her family as Nadia, was born in 1901 in Baku, on the shores of the Caspian Sea. She was the youngest of 4 children. Her father, Sergei Alliluyev, came from a simple peasant family and, as his granddaughter Svetlana later claimed, was half Romani. Consequently, a distinctive feature of all the Alliluyev children was their striking dark features, with all the children inheriting deep black hair and dark, expressive eyes. Sergei Alliluyev's revolutionary activities began in the Georgian city of Tiflis, now known as Tbilisi. Later, he and his family moved to St. Petersburg, where he found employment as the chief of an electrical substation. The Alliluyevs lived comfortably, occupying a spacious 4-room apartment. It was here that Sergei hosted secret Bolshevik meetings and frequently harbored underground revolutionaries, including Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin. Sergei Alliluyev gave his children an excellent education. Nadezhda graduated from a prestigious girls' school, spoke fluent German and French, and played the piano beautifully. In her father's house, she was remembered as a cheerful, kind, and remarkably practical homemaker. Nadezhda's mother, Olga Fedorenko, was born in Georgia to a mixed Ukrainian, German, and Georgian family. In Tiflis, Olga met Sergei Alliluyev and, at the tender age of 14, ran away with him from her family home. This is how biographer Olga Trifonova describes her character.
Nadezhda's mother was an extremely eccentric woman. More than anything in the world, she craved unbridled freedom. This was expressed in the fact that she would often suddenly scream, "I want to be free! Free to do as I please," after which she would leave for her next lover, abandoning her husband and children. Her own children held little interest for her. She frequently left them in the care of others. Thus, Nadezhda lived for long periods with the Rajevsky family, while her sister Anna lived with her father's impoverished relatives. From the age of 14, Nadia was forced to run the household, and during her mother's periodic disappearing acts with a new friend, she managed the entire family budget.
In 1904, in Baku, Sergei Alliluyev met a young Stalin for the first time, when he helped smuggle an illegal printing press used to publish banned revolutionary newspapers into Tiflis. Their second meeting occurred 6 years later in St. Petersburg. Stalin lived in the Alliluyev's apartment for a time. At that time, Nadia was only 9 years old.
My grandfather was a well-known revolutionary. He helped exiles with money and food and hid underground activists. After meeting Stalin, he began to help him as well. When Stalin was sentenced by a czarist court to Siberian exile in the remote Turuhansk region for his revolutionary activities, where political exiles lived not in prison cells but in ordinary taiga villages, my grandfather sent him money. Upon his arrival in the capital, Stalin's first action was to visit my grandfather with gratitude. It was in his house that he first saw Nadia, who was only 10 years old at the time. A close family friendship began, and by a strange coincidence, Stalin paid special attention to little Nadia. He literally would not let her out of his arms, constantly playing with her and buying her dolls. Years later, he would look at her with completely different eyes.
In August 1917, the 38-year-old Stalin, having just returned from his final Siberian exile, stayed with the Alliluyevs once more. In his youth, he was quite handsome, as can be seen in photographs from that period. True, his face was deeply pockmarked from a childhood bout of smallpox, but this did not detract from his appearance. He possessed a thick head of hair brushed back, a fiery gaze, but above all, charisma and magnetic Georgian charm. In those years, Stalin was a cheerful, open man, constantly joking and telling stories, which once prompted Lenin to call him an extraordinary Georgian. He read widely, adored Chekhov, and frequently reread his famous short story, The Darling. Every time he closed the book, he would say, "The ideal female character is dog-like devotion, just like my Siberian dog, Tishka." Stalin had extensive experience with women. Because Tsarist exile was merely forced banishment to the Siberian wilderness rather than a prison, Stalin lived freely among the local peasants, wanted for nothing, and women loved him.
And then, a young, mysterious man appears in the Alliluyev home, and both sisters are instantly captivated by him. Stalin read Chekhov aloud to them, and did so beautifully. He possessed an extraordinary acting talent, which would serve him well in later years. And the young Nadia, of course, completely lost her head.
Rumors circulated that Stalin deliberated for a long time over whom to choose: Nadezhda, who was still very young, or her older sister, Anna. Youth won out. Nadezhda practically ran away with her chosen companion. Her father, Sergei Alliluyev, deeply outraged by the news, complained to a close friend, "Joseph has taken my daughter. Why does he need her? She is still just a child." Stalin and Nadia began living together in the spring of 1918, shortly before the Lenin government relocated to Moscow, where Nadia went to work as Stalin's personal secretary. At the time, Nadezhda was only 16, while Stalin was 39. Their marriage was officially registered 1 year later, on March 24, 1919. Nadezhda's mother, upon learning of this, reacted in her typical harsh manner.
"You are a fool, a fool! I always knew you were a fool. You will regret what you have done many, many times over."
Following the wedding, Nadia did not take her husband's surname and remained an Alliluyeva for the rest of her days. The reason for this was later explained by her niece, Kira Alliluyeva.
Stalin himself opposed the name change. Very few people in the country knew that his real surname was Jugashvili, and Joseph carefully concealed this fact.
From her childhood, Nadezhda did not have an easy life. Her mother frequently left home in search of unbridled freedom, abandoning the children to their fate. Consequently, Nadia learned to run the household early. Everyone had to be fed, clothed, and washed. Yet she held no grudge against her mother, never judging or complaining about her. These lines from a letter by a 13-year-old Nadezhda reveal her maturity.
"Mama is still young. She wants her own life, not just to fuss over us."
Both Polish and Romani ancestry ran strong in Nadia, which manifested in her pride and defiance. Her father was deeply concerned by his daughter's hot-tempered and stubborn nature. Despite all of this, Nadezhda remained kind and caring. From childhood, she was known for her playfulness and quick wit, yet at the same time, she was modest and shy. At family gatherings, she would often sit silently, wrapped in a shawl, displaying that distinct Romani love for shawls. But when she was coaxed into dancing, everyone present watched her with admiration. Nadezhda was a strikingly attractive, slender, and delicate young woman, possessing a rare, magnetic charm.
The incompatibility between Nadezhda and Stalin was absolute from the very start. Nadia came from a family of the Russian intelligentsia. She was intelligent. In the archives, I found evidence that she edited Stalin's articles. But he grew up in a completely different environment. First, bad company, then expropriations, essentially armed bank robberies for the cause of the revolution. He was a street thug and, to his dying day, carried the habits of a Tiflis thief. He spoke almost exclusively in profanities, renowned for his vulgarity and crude behavior. Even at meetings of the Politburo, Stalin allowed himself to use obscene language, all of which is documented. With Nadia, he did not mince his words either. This deeply wounded her, but initially she tried to adapt and not show that his crudeness affected her so deeply.
Stalin constantly watched Nadia, driven by an intense jealousy, even toward his own eldest son, Yakov, who was only 6 years younger than his stepmother. Stalin's first wife, Ekaterina Svanidze, had died of typhus when Yakov was just 8 months old. Consumed by party affairs and the revolution, Stalin did not involve himself in raising the child. The boy was raised in Tiflis by his late mother's sister, Alexandra Svanidze. Moving to Moscow to live with his father, Yakov proved completely unprepared for life in the capital. He could do almost nothing, was spoiled, delicate, and struggled in school. Nadia immediately took Yakov under her wing. She felt sorry for the youth and helped him with his schoolwork until Stalin caught them together in the kitchen.
When asked about Yakov, Nadia replied that only with him did she feel like herself, feeling a boundless warmth toward him. And how could she not? After all, he was an orphan, raised without a mother. But it was this very display of tenderness that infuriated her husband. It was then that Stalin first called her a whore, just like her mother. Later, in 1925, when Yakov was 18 and his stepmother Nadezhda was 24, Yakov slept in their apartment on a black oilcloth sofa behind a curtain. The confrontation began when Nadezhda suggested moving Yakov upstairs to the mezzanine, into a tiny room at the end of the hallway. As always, Stalin's first reaction was outwardly calm. But that evening, he asked a deeply insulting question. "Trying to keep him closer to you?" He violently yanked the curtain aside, threw the bedding from the sofa onto the floor, rummaged through the nightstand, and tore off the sheet. Terrified and pale, Yakov stood there in a thin, cotton nightshirt, understanding nothing. What was Stalin searching for in his things? Love letters? His wife's undergarments? It was madness.
Stalin openly hated his own son. According to Olga Trifonova, the father could not forgive Yakov for his mediocrity. As a result of constant abuse and conflicts with his father, Yakov attempted suicide. It was unsuccessful. The bullet passed straight through. Yakov survived, but was ill for a long time. Stalin's attitude toward him grew even more cruel. At their first meeting after the incident, his father mockingly spat at him. "Ha! You missed. You can't even shoot yourself." Nadezhda's relationship with her husband began to deteriorate rapidly in the early 1920s. By that time, Alliluyeva was working in the personal secretariat of Vladimir Lenin, who was already gravely ill.
In 1922, Stalin was appointed General Secretary of the party. That winter, he was shown Lenin's Secret Testament, a document in which the dying leader recommended that his comrades find a way to remove Stalin from his post. Stalin's political future was on the line, and at the time, the odds were not in his favor. Undergoing colossal pressure, he took out all his anger and resentment on Nadia at home. Their relationship at that time became unbearable. Nadezhda was deeply wounded by his rudeness, constant profanities, and outright insolence. Stalin would defiantly spit on the wall. At first, Nadezhda silently wiped away these marks. Then she hung a small rug on the wall. But Stalin began to deliberately spit past it. He was a scoundrel, yet he knew perfectly well how to control his manners. After all, years later he would easily charm the sophisticated Winston Churchill. This meant only one thing. At home, Stalin did all of this intentionally, seeking to humiliate his wife as painfully as possible.
Unable to endure the abuse, Nadezhda fled from her husband several times. In March 1924, feeling her labor contractions begin, she simply boarded a tram and traveled alone to a Moscow maternity hospital on Solyanka Street to give birth to their son, Vasily. Her terrified relatives could not find her for a long time. The second time, she left for Leningrad to stay with her father, taking their infant daughter, Svetlana, with her.
Nadezhda was rumored to have had a secret affair with the charismatic leader of the Leningrad Communists, Sergei Kirov. Rumors claimed that she fled to Leningrad not to see her father, but to be with him. Kirov indeed harbored warm feelings for Nadezhda, sincerely pitied her, and tried to protect her. However, the rumors of their romantic affair are most likely groundless.
Stalin completely neglected his wife and showed her absolutely no consideration. By the age of 29, the young woman had practically become an invalid.
In her secret medical file, 10 abortions had been recorded, and in those years, such procedures were performed without any anesthesia. Later, during her treatment at the famous Carlsbad spa resort in Czechoslovakia, the German doctor examining her lost his composure and exclaimed, "Poor thing, you are living with an animal." Because Nadezhda had to bottle up all her grievances, she began to suffer from agonizing migraines and spikes in blood pressure. To dull the pain, she constantly carried caffeine tablets in her purse. In addition, she suffered from sharp stomach pains. Doctors suspected an ulcer, but she never received any serious medical treatment.
The turning point in their relationship came in 1929. After the birth of her children, Nadezhda had spent a long time managing only the household, living in complete information isolation in the Kremlin. While Stalin's family dined on black caviar, millions of people in the country were starving. But in 1929, Nadezhda enrolled in the prestigious Moscow Industrial Academy and suddenly plunged into a completely different reality. There, she found her own social circle. Visiting classmates in the dormitory of the Industrial Academy on Vorontsova Polye, she heard for the first time what the Soviet newspapers remained silent about: the real poverty of the workers, the brutal violence during collectivization in the countryside, and the forced dekulakization of hundreds of thousands of peasant families. Unsurprisingly, opposition to Stalin ran strong within the walls of the academy.
During her medical trips to Germany, Nadezhda spoke at length with her brother Pavel Alliluyev. He served as a Soviet trade representative in Berlin and, by all accounts, carried out secret tasks for military intelligence. As a professional military officer, Pavel understood the hidden mechanisms of Stalin's policies perfectly. Years later, in 1937, when the mass repressions began and Stalin's purges targeted his close friends, Pavel personally went to the secret police and declared, "Arrest me as well." And this worked temporarily. His friends were released one by one until the leadership decided to end this defiance. In 1938, Pavel Alliluyev died suddenly in his office under deeply mysterious circumstances. Historians have little doubt that he was poisoned. It was after these candid conversations with her brother in Berlin that Nadezhda returned to Moscow a completely different person.
Shortly after returning from Berlin, Nadezhda personally traveled to the Urals, to Chelyabinsk, to protect a classmate who faced serious trouble along party lines. She possessed a heightened sense of justice and frequently attempted to save people from Stalin's repressive machine, even though her intercession sometimes only worsened the plight of those unfortunate souls. During this period, Nadezhda began to clearly understand the true face of her husband's regime. At the Industrial Academy, almost no one knew whose wife Nadezhda actually was. One of the few who was aware was her classmate and the leader of the local party cell, the future Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. It was Nadezhda who eventually introduced Khrushchev to her husband. Khrushchev himself later admitted in his memoirs that Alliluyeva's glowing reviews of him determined his career, calling his meeting with her his lucky lottery ticket. In those years, the Industrial Academy was a stronghold of the so-called right opposition, a party faction that opposed Stalin's radical reforms in the countryside. When students elected candidates at an internal conference who were not approved by the Kremlin, Khrushchev made his first career leap. He published a devastating article in the party newspaper Pravda, targeting the old professors and the Academy's opposition leadership. Following this, Khrushchev was elected secretary of the party committee and immediately launched brutal political purges at the Academy. Seeing this absurdity, Nadezhda wrote with irony in one of her letters, "They've even labeled me a right-winger here." For any other Soviet citizen, such a joke would have ended in a firing squad basement. By 1932, Stalin's struggle against his political rivals was in full swing. A secret opposition group known as the Union of Marxist-Leninists emerged, led by Martymyan Ryutin. At the same time, a deep rift was growing within Stalin's own family, and Nadezhda left for her sister's home in the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. It was there that the notorious Ryutin Manifesto was being clandestinely distributed, a secret document containing a scathing critique of Stalin's policies and calling for his immediate removal from power.
It is highly possible that Nadezhda had contacts with Ryutin's opposition. If Stalin, who kept his wife under close surveillance, discovered that she had sided with his enemies, then, knowing his character, his most logical recourse was to destroy her. And he did, in fact, discover that very Ryutin Manifesto in Nadezhda's bedroom. For context, senior Bolsheviks Zinoviev and Kamenev, merely for holding this document in their hands, were immediately expelled from the party and sent into exile.
On November 8, 1932, a traditional banquet was held in the Kremlin apartment of Stalin's close friend, Soviet Defense Minister Clement Voroshilov, celebrating the 15th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. The banquet table was filled with the Soviet political and military elite, accompanied by their spouses. On her final evening, Nadezhda looked extraordinarily striking. She wore a fashionable evening dress and bright red lipstick, though she usually dressed with deliberate modesty, in the spirit of harsh party ideology. According to eyewitnesses, right in front of his wife, Stalin began openly flirting with the young wife of General Alexander Yegorov. To make matters worse, the table was buzzing with a recent rumor about Stalin's affair with a Kremlin hairdresser. The atmosphere grew incredibly tense when Stalin raised a toast to the destruction of the enemies of the Soviet state, but noticed that Nadezhda defiantly refused to raise her glass. Losing his temper, he threw something at his wife. Some sources say an orange peel, others a piece of bread, hitting her directly in the face. Stalin rudely shouted to her across the table, "Hey you, drink up!" To which Nadezhda sharply replied, "My name is not Hey." Many memoirists claim that immediately after this scene, Nadezhda silently stood up and left the banquet. However, Olga Trifonova refutes this version.
It is not true that she immediately stood up and left. Nadezhda remained at the table. She was not the kind of woman who could be insulted so easily that she would run out of the room like a beaten dog. It required immense self-control to endure such humiliation.
Nadezhda also endured the fact that, right during the banquet, Stalin defiantly left to make a phone call to his alleged mistress. This loud telephone conversation was heard by many guests. The dictator was not ashamed to publicly humiliate his wife. He then ordered a car to take him to his country dacha. Nadezhda stayed until the very end of the gathering, leaving only at 1 in the morning. She returned to her empty Kremlin apartment, where she would be found dead the next morning. Stalin did indeed leave for his dacha, but for some reason, he had already returned to the Kremlin by early morning. For many historians, This is a key argument that Stalin personally shot his wife. And yet, Olga Trifonova believes Stalin did not do it.
Nadezhda committed suicide because she faced a terrifying choice. Within Ryutin's opposition circle, desperate cries were often heard. Is there no one ready to kill Stalin? If Nadezhda, as the person closest to him, was tasked with eliminating her husband, she chose instead to turn the weapon on herself. By 1932, Nadezhda was already a strong individual. Shortly before her death, she flung these words directly in her husband's face. "You torture everyone. You torture me. You torture the entire nation." In those final days, those close to her noticed her detached, empty gaze. Near the end of her life, Nadezhda was in such deep despair that she once confessed to a friend, "I'm tired of everything." Her close friend asked in horror, "What, even the children?" "Yes, even the children," Nadezhda replied quietly. Nothing in this life brought her joy anymore. Her dreams had collapsed, her hopes were shattered, and her dignity was crushed. Yet, if the conspirators indeed tasked her with killing the dictator, she made a different choice. She could not forget the years when she, a 16-year-old girl, loved him devotedly and, pressed against his shoulder, endured all the horrors of the civil war with her husband. Besides, Stalin had been the only man in her life.